Cale Dravenmore returned to Crimsonreach Manor without warning. No one knew he was back. The fortress was silent, the way it had been for 3 years. But then he heard something, a sound coming from somewhere deep within the stone halls. His entire body went rigid. By instinct, his hand moved to the obsidian blade at his side. Yet it wasn't the sound of invasion. He didn't know what it was. He moved toward it, following the noise, both hands trembling with something he'd forgotten how to name. It was coming from the sunlit hall. He reached the archway, and what he saw made time itself stop. Cale Dravenmore was the Vampire King, the immortal sovereign of Crimsonreach and ruler of the blood courts across 3 continents. He controlled the night. He commanded armies that could eclipse kingdoms. Ancient vampire houses bowed when they heard his name. Everything he touched either flourished under his dominion or burned to ash at his will. But power couldn't bring back what he'd lost. His queen, Veloria Dravenmore, was assassinated, murdered in a blood ritual by a rival court. The Mordrath Coven, an ancient family hungry for his throne, wanted to send a message. They ambushed her carriage as she was returning from a diplomatic summit with their 3 newborn heirs, Riven, Aloan, and Thane. Veloria used her own body and the last of her magic as a shield. She died before the sun set. The Triplets survived. Not a mark on them. Cale was in the Eastern Territories negotiating a blood treaty when the Raven arrived. At her funeral pyre, something shattered inside his 3 infants. Riven, Aloan, and Thane, barely 6 months old, identical triplets with midnight hair and their mother's silver eyes. They stopped making sound. All 3 of them. At the same moment, Riven used to reach for everything with curious hands. Aloan smiled at candlelight. Thane cooed when anyone sang. Now there was nothing. Silence. 3 years of absolute silence. Not a single cry, not a laugh, not even a whimper during fevers or falls. You could walk into the nursery and find 3 small souls holding each other, staring into distance like ghosts learning to haunt their own home. Cale did what any father with unlimited resources and ancient magic would do. He spent fortunes trying to fix what was broken. Blood mages from the oldest covens. Healers who'd cured plagues. Scholars who'd studied trauma across centuries. One ritual after another. He took them to moonlit gardens, to enchanted forests, to sanctuaries protected by ancient wards. He commissioned toys crafted by master artisans, summoned musicians from courts across the realm, even brought them a phoenix hatchling someone swore would restore joy. Nothing worked. The children stayed locked inside themselves, silent together, as if they'd made a pact with grief itself. He did something else, too. He hunted down the Mordrath Coven. One by one, he made them pay in blood and fire. It took him 8 months to erase them from existence. But vengeance didn't bring Veloria back, and it didn't make his children speak again. So Cale did what broken men often do. He ran. He buried himself in conquest. 20-hour war councils, campaigns every season. The northern wastes, the southern blood courts, territories across the sea. Because sitting in that manor, looking at 3 silent children who had her eyes, felt like drowning in centuries of failure. His estate in Crimsonreach had 40 rooms, a library spanning 3 floors, halls that echoed with the footsteps of kings, gardens where Veloria once walked under moonlight. But it was the loneliest place in all the immortal realms. CTA placeholder, and before we continue, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a like if you believe even vampires deserve second chances, and comment where you're watching from, because this story will show you that even in eternal darkness, healing can find its way home. One evening, Alara stood in the doorway of Cale's war room. She'd been with the Dravenmore household for 30 years. She'd watched Cale transform from a reckless prince into a king who reshaped the blood courts. She'd stood beside him on his wedding night, the day his children were born, and the day Veloria's ashes scattered into wind. But now she was exhausted. "My lord, I need to speak with you." Cale didn't look up from the territorial maps spread across the obsidian table. "Speak." Illyra drew a steady breath. I can no longer manage this manor and care for the 3 young heirs alone. The estate is too vast. The children need more attention than I can provide. I need to hire additional staff. Cale still didn't look up. The quill in his hand kept scratching across parchment Illyra suspected contained death warrants. Hire whomever you need, Illyra, but vet them thoroughly. Use the blood binding if necessary. His voice was empty, as if she'd just asked about ordering more candles. Illyra nodded and stepped out. She knew that was all she would get from this king who'd forgotten how to be a father. 3 nights later, Illyra Fenwick stood before a 12-foot iron gate wrapped in ancient protective wards. She looked up. Gargoyles perched along the walls, their stone eyes tracking her movement. At least 7 she could count, maybe more hidden in shadow. The gate opened slowly, without anyone touching it. They'd been watching her since she left the village road. Illyra stepped inside. A cobblestone path led through gardens of night-blooming flowers to a massive Gothic manor. No, not a manor. This was a vampire's stronghold, a kingdom carved from stone and centuries of bloodline. 2 figures in dark ceremonial armor stood at the entrance. They didn't greet her. They didn't move. They simply watched, their hands resting on weapons that gleamed even in darkness. She noticed their eyes, crimson-tinged. Not human. Vampires. Both of them. Illyra swallowed. Her heart was beating so fast she worried they could hear it. They probably could. She glanced to her left. A carriage sat in the courtyard, black as midnight, carved with protective sigils. She'd heard stories of vehicles like this, meant for vampire royalty traveling through hostile territory. Go back. A voice in her head screamed. Go back, Illyra. This isn't a place for someone like you. But she needed this position. She needed coin to rebuild what she'd lost. She needed purpose to survive. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She kept walking. A woman led her inside. The manor was even more imposing than she'd imagined. Vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow, chandeliers of crystal and silver, marble floors polished to mirror brightness. Everything was ancient. Everything was powerful. And quiet. Quiet in a way that felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Illyra met her in the receiving hall, a woman who appeared to be in her 50s, though Illyra suspected she was much, much older. Silver streaked through her hair. Her eyes were tired but still sharp. She looked Illyra up and down. You're Illyra Fenwick? Yes, my lady. Illyra gestured to a chair. Sit. Illyra sat, keeping her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Illyra was silent for a long moment. Then she asked, her voice low and direct, Are you frightened? Illyra knew she wasn't asking about the work. She was asking about this place, about the vampire guards, about the ancient magic humming through every stone, about serving immortal creatures who could end her with a thought. Illyra looked straight into Illyra's eyes. Yes, I'm frightened. Illyra said nothing. But I've been frightened of many things in my life. I'm still here. A moment passed. Then Illyra nodded slowly. For the first time, something like respect flickered in her expression. You're hired. You start tomorrow at moonrise. Your quarters are in the eastern wing. I'll explain your duties later. For now, you should learn this manner first. Illyra stood. Illyra led her through the corridors, the great hall, the dining chamber, the conservatory where moonlight filtered through stained glass, the library that seemed endless. Every room was larger than any building Illyra had ever lived in. They were passing through the second-floor gallery when Illyra heard a voice. Cold, commanding like winter itself given speech. Tell Valdrin if he doesn't swear fealty within 3 nights, he won't need to swear anything. Ever. Illyra froze. Every instinct screamed danger. A figure stepped out from the chamber at the hall's end. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing formal attire as dark as shadow and fitted with precision that spoke of centuries of tailored perfection. Sharp features, a strong jaw, and eyes colder and more ancient than anything Illyra had ever witnessed. He was speaking through a communication orb, but he paused when he saw them. His gaze swept over Illyra. Quick, assessing, as if she were furniture, something not worth remembering. Then he walked past without a word, his cloak moving like smoke. Illyra couldn't breathe until he disappeared down the stairs. That's the king. Lord Kale, Illyra said softly. You don't need to know much about him. Just do your work well and stay out of his path. Illyra nodded, though her hands were still shaking. They continued onward, but when they reached the grand staircase, Illyra stopped. 3 small figures stood on the 5th step, holding hands, looking down at her. Midnight black hair, enormous silver eyes, faces so identical Illyra couldn't tell them apart. 3 small souls dressed in clothes too fine for children who never played. Yet their eyes were empty, like dolls, like beautiful statues that had forgotten they were once alive. That's Riven, Aloan, and Thane, Illyra said, her voice dropping to something almost reverent. The king's 3 heirs. They don't speak to anyone. It's been 3 years. Illyra looked at the 3 children, and the 3 children looked back at her. For the first time in 3 years, their eyes followed a stranger, not with fear, but with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or hope so fragile it might shatter if named. Illyra didn't know why, but she felt that something had just shifted. An invisible thread had just been woven between her and those 3 silent souls. She didn't know that thread would change everything. On her first night, Illyra began work at moonrise. She dusted shelves of books older than kingdoms. She polished silver that had belonged to vampire lords centuries dead. She cleaned windows that looked out over gardens where nothing mortal grew. Illyra followed her from room to room. She didn't say a word. She only watched. But Illyra didn't yet know the true weight of the silence she'd entered. She didn't know about the queen who never returned, or the night 3 years ago when blood and fire consumed everything. To understand why those 3 children stopped speaking, you have to understand what Kale Dravenmore lost, and what he became in the losing. But Illyra didn't yet know the true weight of the silence she'd entered. She didn't know about the queen who never returned, or the night 3 years ago when blood and fire consumed everything. To understand why those 3 children stopped speaking, you have to understand what Kale Dravenmore lost, and what he became in the losing. 3 years earlier, Crimson Reach Manor had been alive. Vealoria Dravenmore walked through those same halls with purpose and grace, her silver hair catching moonlight like captured starfire. She was not merely Kale's queen. She was his equal in every way that mattered. Where he commanded through dominance and ancient right, she ruled through strategy and measured wisdom. Where his instinct was to crush opposition, hers was to convert it into alliance. They'd met during a blood court negotiation that nearly erupted into war. Kale had arrived ready to slaughter. Vealoria had arrived ready to negotiate. Within 3 hours, she'd restructured the entire territorial agreement in a way that gave Kale everything he wanted while making the opposing court believe they'd won. He'd been fascinated, then captivated, then, against every instinct of a creature who trusted nothing, in love. You see enemies everywhere, she told him once, standing in the very gallery where Illyra would one day meet his children. I see potential allies who simply don't know it yet. And when will they betray you? Kale had asked. Then you remind them why they shouldn't have. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes held steel. Mercy isn't weakness, Kale. It's strategic patience. It was the only philosophy they ever truly disagreed on. Kale believed in absolute power, in dominance so complete that rebellion became unthinkable. Vealoria believed in balance, in building a legacy that would endure not through fear, but through respect earned across centuries. Our children will inherit an empire, she told him when she discovered she was carrying triplets, a rarity even among vampires. Let it be one they can be proud of, not one built entirely on ash. Kale had agreed because he would have given her anything. He didn't know he was making a promise he'd never get to keep. The Mordrath Coven had been a minor blood court, ambitious, but manageable. Kale had refused their request for territorial expansion 3 times. He'd considered it handled. He'd been wrong. Veloria was returning from the Eastern Summit, barely 2 months after giving birth to Riven, Aloan, and Thane. The infants traveled with her. She'd insisted, wanting them to see the courts they would one day help govern. Kale had protested. She'd overruled him with that smile that meant her mind was made. The attack happened at dusk, in the mountain pass 20 leagues from Crimson Reach. 17 Mordrath assassins ambushed her carriage. They'd used forbidden magic, blood wards designed to trap even ancient vampires. Veiloria's guards fought with legendary ferocity. All of them died. Inside the carriage, Veiloria had seconds to act. The triplets were screaming, their infant cries piercing even through the sounds of battle and death. She pulled the last of her magic, every ounce of power she possessed, and wove it into a shield around her children. Not around herself. Around them. When Kale's forces arrived 13 minutes later, they found carnage. Bodies everywhere. The carriage in ruins. And Veiloria collapsed over her 3 infants, her body riddled with blade wounds, her silver eyes still open, staring at nothing. The babies were untouched. Crying. Alive. She'd used herself as the final barrier when her magic wasn't enough. Kale arrived from the Eastern Territories within the hour, traveling faster than should have been possible even for a vampire king. He'd felt the moment she died, their bond severing like a limb torn away. He knelt beside her body in that mountain pass, covered in the blood of his queen and 17 assassins, and something fundamental inside him shattered. At her funeral pyre 3 nights later, Kale stood with Riven, Aloan, and Thane in his arms. The infants had been crying since the attack. Constant, piercing wails that echoed through Crimson Reach like an accusation. But as the flames consumed their mother's body and her ashes began to rise, they stopped. All 3 of them. At exactly the same moment, the silence was so sudden, so absolute, that Kale thought they'd stopped breathing. But they were breathing. They simply weren't making sound anymore. They stared at the flames with those silver eyes they'd inherited from her, and it was as if they'd collectively decided that a world without their mother wasn't worth speaking in. Kale tried everything. Ancient blood mages examined them and found no curse. Healers who'd practiced for centuries discovered no physical cause. Scholars researched every recorded case of trauma-induced silence. Nothing explained it. Nothing fixed it. "They're grieving, my lord," one elder finally told him. Sometimes grief steals the voice before the mind can process the loss. "Then make them stop grieving," Kale had snarled. "That's not something magic can do." Weeks became months. The nursery became a tomb of living silence. Kale would stand in the doorway, watching his children hold each other, their eyes empty, and feel the weight of his failure crushing him. He'd built an empire. He commanded the darkness itself. But he couldn't protect the one person who mattered, and he couldn't heal the 3 souls she died to save. Every time he looked at them, he saw her sacrifice. Every time he entered that room, he felt the phantom pain of her death. The nursery smelled like grief and guilt and the suffocating weight of promises broken. 6 months after Veiloria's death, a border dispute erupted in the northern wastes. It required a king's presence, they said. Kale volunteered immediately. The campaign would last 3 months. He told himself he was serving his empire. He told the council he was securing their borders. But Alara knew. She saw the relief in his eyes when he gave the order to mobilize. The night before he left, Kale stood in the nursery doorway one final time. Riven, Aloan, and Thane sat together on the floor, holding hands, staring at shadows. They didn't acknowledge him. They never did anymore. "I'll return," he told them, though he didn't know if they heard him or if they cared. He didn't know that it would be 3 years before he kept that promise. And he didn't know that when he finally did return, everything would have changed, not because of his power, but because of a maid who understood that sometimes the greatest magic is simply choosing to stay. Kale walked out of Crimson Reach Manor that night and didn't look back. Behind him, in the nursery, 3 silent children watched the door where their father had been. They didn't cry. They didn't call out. They simply held each other tighter and waited, in silence, for someone who would never leave. Cale walked out of Crimson Reach Manor that night and didn't look back. Behind him, in the nursery, 3 silent children watched the door where their father had been. They didn't cry. They didn't call out. They simply held each other tighter and waited, in silence, for someone who would never leave. That someone arrived 2.5 years later, carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag that weighed less than grief itself. Illyra Fenwick had learned something about loss that most people never understand. It doesn't arrive all at once like a storm. It comes in pieces, slowly dismantling your life one familiar thing at a time until you wake up one morning and realize you're living in a world you no longer recognize. First, the fever took her mother. Then her father, 6 months later, from a heart that simply gave up. Her younger brother, Theo, had been her last anchor until the winter conscription came. The kingdom needed soldiers for a war Illyra didn't understand and Theo didn't return from. 3 letters, then silence. Then an officer at her door with a standard apology and her brother's belongings in a wooden box. The village had been sympathetic at first. But sympathy expires when you can't pay rent. The small cottage became someone else's home. Her mother's garden grew wild under different hands. Illyra found herself wandering from town to town, taking whatever work she could find, washing dishes, mending clothes, mucking stables. Anything that let her disappear into routine and forget that she was 23 years old and completely alone in the world. When she heard about a position at Crimson Reach Manor, the other women in the boarding house had warned her away. "That's the Vampire King's estate," one whispered. "People who go there don't come back the same." "Nothing there but grief and silence," another added. "They say his children are cursed." But Illyra had nodded and applied anyway, because grief and silence were things she understood. And because she'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive your own haunting is to walk into someone else's. The pay was generous, far more than any normal household would offer. That alone told her everything she needed to know about how desperate they were for staff willing to work in a vampire's home. On her second night at Crimson Reach, after Illyra had shown her the basics of her duties, Illyra prepared to begin her evening rounds. She wore the simple uniform provided, a modest blue dress with a white apron, practical and plain. Her auburn hair was pulled back with a yellow ribbon, one of the few belongings she'd kept from before. Her mother had given it to her. She kept her appearance neat but unremarkable, her posture gentle, her movements quiet. She'd learned long ago that invisible people were left alone, and being left alone felt safer than being seen. "One more thing," Illyra said as Illyra was about to leave the servants' hall. "The nursery on the 3rd floor, stay away from it." Illyra paused. "Why?" "The king's children." Illyra's expression tightened. "They don't speak. Haven't for 3 years. The other staff find it unsettling. It's better to leave them be. I handle their care." A younger servant named Mira, who'd been listening, leaned in. "It's not natural, that silence. Like they're not really there. Like little ghosts. Some of us think they're cursed." "They're not cursed," Illyra said sharply. "They're children. Grieving children. But yes, Illyra, it's easier if you focus on the rest of the manor." Illyra nodded, but the warning settled in her chest like a stone. She knew what it meant to be called unsettling. She knew what it felt like when people decided it was easier to avoid you than understand you. That night, she couldn't sleep. The servants' quarters felt too quiet, or maybe she felt too restless. She found herself walking the manor's corridors, learning its rhythms. Her rounds took her past the grand staircase, past the gallery, up to the 3rd floor where she wasn't supposed to go. She told herself she was just exploring. But when she reached the nursery door, slightly ajar, soft lamplight spilling out, she stopped. From inside came the sound of Illyra's footsteps, then the older woman emerged carrying a tray of untouched food. Illyra saw her and sighed. "I told you." "I know," Illyra said quietly. I'll go." But as Illyra walked past her down the hall, Illyra looked through the gap in the doorway. 3 small figures sat on a plush rug in the center of the room, holding hands. Riven, Eloan, and Thane. Even from a distance, she could see the identical midnight curls, the 2 still postures, the silver eyes that stared at nothing and everything. They looked exactly like the children in every village she'd passed through, except those children had been laughing, fighting, crying, living. These 3 looked like they were carved from porcelain and sorrow. Something in Illyra's chest cracked open. Not pity. Recognition. The next morning, she found Illyra in the kitchen. "The nursery," Illyra said. "Let me help with it." Illyra looked up from the tea she was preparing. "I told you. I know what you told me. Let me help anyway." Illyra kept her voice steady. "You're managing this entire estate. You can't do everything. And She paused. "I don't find them unsettling. I find them lonely." Illyra studied her for a long moment. Then, perhaps because she was exhausted, or perhaps because something in Illyra's eyes reminded her of Valoria's stubbornness, she nodded.
"Fine.
Start this afternoon. But don't expect anything from them. Not words, not smiles, nothing. They won't even look at you." That afternoon, Illyra entered the nursery with fresh linens and a cart of cleaning supplies. The triplets were sitting by the window, bathed in late afternoon light.
They didn't turn when she entered.
Didn't acknowledge her presence at all. "Hello," Illyra said softly. "My name is Illyra. I'm going to be helping take care of this room. I'll try not to disturb you." Silence. Not even a flicker of movement. She began her work, changing bedding, dusting shelves, organizing toys that looked like they'd never been played with. She didn't speak to them like children who needed to be coaxed or commanded. She spoke to them the way she wished someone had spoken to her after Theo died. "The light is beautiful right now," she said while folding a blanket. "My mother used to say that late afternoon sun was the color of honey and hope." Silence. "I had a brother once. His name was Theo. He used to make me laugh at the worst times." Stillness. Sometimes when people leave, it feels like the world gets too loud. So you make yourself quiet to match the emptiness. For the first time, the smallest movement, Eloan's head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward Illyra's voice. Illyra didn't react, didn't celebrate or push. She simply continued her work, speaking softly about nothing important, the garden outside, the stars she'd seen last night, the song her mother used to hum. When her shift ended an hour later, she quietly gathered her supplies. "I'll come back tomorrow," she told them, "if that's all right with you." She didn't expect a response. She didn't get one. But as she reached the door, she glanced back. All 3 children were watching her now. Not with fear or suspicion. With something else. Something that looked almost like curiosity. That evening, when Illyra asked how it went, Illyra simply said, "They're just children who miss their mother." That night, instead of returning to her quarters after supper, Illyra went back to the nursery. The children were in their beds, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She sat in the chair by the window and began to hum. Nothing specific, just a melody her mother had loved. She stayed for an hour. Then 2. When she finally left, Riven's eyes had closed. It was the first time in weeks he'd fallen asleep before midnight. Illyra didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. The silence had found someone who wasn't afraid of it. And slowly, quietly, it began to crack. Illyra didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. The silence had found someone who wasn't afraid of it. And slowly, quietly, it began to crack. The first week, nothing changed. Illyra came to the nursery every afternoon and evening, completing her duties while speaking softly about small, inconsequential things. The children watched her. They'd started doing that from the second day, but they never moved, never responded, never gave any indication they heard her at all. Illyra checked on her daily. "You don't have to stay so long," she said on the 5th evening, finding Illyra still sitting by the window after the children had been put to bed. "They don't know the difference." "Yes, they do," Illyra said quietly. She didn't elaborate. Illyra didn't press. By the second week, Illyra had established a rhythm. She arrived at the nursery each afternoon as the sun began its descent, bringing with her not just cleaning supplies but intention. She'd sit on the floor with them, not demanding they engage, just existing in their space. She'd hum while folding their clothes. She'd tell stories while tidying their toys. But she never told them happy stories. She'd learned quickly that cheerful tales about heroes and adventures made them retreat further into themselves. Instead, she told them the truth. "When my brother died," she said one afternoon while organizing their bookshelf, "I stopped talking for a while too. Not because I couldn't, because words felt like they belonged to the world before, and I was living in the world after. Do you know what I mean?" Thane's fingers tightened around Aloan's hand. It was the first intentional movement Illyra had seen from any of them. She continued as if she hadn't noticed. "My mother used to say that grief isn't something you get over. It's something you learn to carry differently." By the third week, Illyra began speaking about Baeloria. Not about the queen, about the mother. She'd asked Illyra for stories, and the older woman had shared them reluctantly at first, then with increasing openness, as if she'd been waiting years for someone to ask. "Your mother loved moonlight," Illyra told them one evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor while they sat on their small chairs. "Illyra said she used to dance in the garden during full moons. Did you know that?"
She paused.
"She probably would have danced with you when you were older, taught you the old songs." Aloan's eyes, which had been fixed on the window, slowly moved to Illyra's face. "She chose you," Illyra continued softly. "In the end, when she could have saved herself, she chose you instead. That's not a legend or a story. That's just the truth. Your mother loved you more than her own life." A tear slid down Riven's cheek. He didn't make a sound, didn't sob, but the tears fell anyway, the first emotion Illyra had witnessed from any of them beyond stillness.
She didn't comment on it.
She simply kept speaking, her voice gentle as twilight. By the fifth week, Illyra began to notice their distinct personalities emerging like stars through clouds. Riven was the protector. Whenever Illyra moved too quickly or made an unexpected noise, he would shift his body slightly in front of his sisters. He was the one who watched the door, who tracked every sound in the hallway, who never fully relaxed. "You're taking care of them," Illyra told him one afternoon. "That's a heavy thing for someone so young to carry." She didn't expect a response. She never did. But Riven's shoulders lowered slightly, as if her acknowledgement had given him permission to rest, even just for a moment. Aloan was the curious one. Her eyes followed everything Illyra did with sharp attention. When Illyra brought flowers from the garden to brighten the room, Aloan stared at them for an entire hour. When Illyra sang, Aloan's lips would move almost imperceptibly, as if trying to remember how mouths formed music. "You want to know how things work, don't you?" Illyra said to her while brushing her hair one evening. Aloan didn't nod, but her eyes met Illyra's in the mirror, and that was answer enough. Thane was the frightened one, the youngest by minutes, Illyra had told her, and somehow the most fragile. He startled at shadows. He wouldn't let go of his siblings' hands. When Illyra entered the room each day, Thane would hide his face against Riven's shoulder until he'd confirmed it was only her. "It's all right to be scared," Illyra whispered to him one night when she found him awake long after his brother and sister had fallen asleep. She sat on the floor beside his bed. "The world feels dangerous when the person who kept you safe is gone. But I promise you, I'm not going anywhere." She stayed beside his bed until his breathing evened out, until his small fist unclenched from his blanket. The first sound happened on the 53rd day. Illyra had stopped counting, but Illyra hadn't. Illyra was singing, a lullaby her mother used to sing, something about stars and silver rivers and finding your way home. She'd sung it dozens of times before. But this time, as she reached the chorus, Thane's mouth opened. Not to speak, just to breathe in sync with the melody, the smallest exhalation of sound. Not quite a hum, not quite silent. Illyra's voice didn't falter. She didn't gasp or celebrate or draw attention to it. She simply continued singing, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if she'd been expecting it all along. When the song ended, Thane's mouth closed again. But something had been proven. The silence could be broken. It just needed to feel safe enough to crack. The days continued. Illyra kept coming.
Keep speaking.
I kept singing. The children kept watching, kept existing in that space between silence and sound, testing whether this woman who smelled like lavender and spoke like safety would actually stay. It was on a Tuesday evening, 8 weeks after Illyra had first entered the nursery, when everything shifted. She was telling them a story, not a sad one this time, but not a false one either. A story about her brother teaching her to skip stones at the river, about how he'd laughed when she'd accidentally splashed him. And then he pushed me in, Illyra said, smiling at the memory. And I was so angry, but then I looked at his face, and he was laughing so hard he couldn't breathe, and Eloan laughed. It was barely a sound, a soft exhale of breath that carried the ghost of joy. But it was a laugh, real and fragile and impossible. The room froze. Riven and Thane turned to look at their sister. Eloan's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with shock at the sound she'd made. Illyra didn't rush to her, didn't make it significant. She simply smiled and said, "Your uncle probably would have laughed like that too. He loved mischief." She continued her story as if nothing world-altering had just occurred. But inside, her heart was thundering, because she knew what that laugh meant. It meant the silence wasn't a curse. It was a choice. And choices could be unmade. That night, when Illyra came to check the nursery, she found Illyra sitting on the floor, tears streaming down her face, while 3 children slept peacefully for the first time in 3 years. "What happened?" Illyra whispered. She laughed. Illyra said, her voice breaking. Eloan laughed. Illyra's hand went to her mouth. In the doorway, she stood perfectly still, staring at the 3 sleeping children as if seeing them for the first time. "How?" she finally asked. Illyra wiped her eyes. "I just stayed." "Did you feel that? Did you feel the moment Eloan laughed for the first time in 3 years? That's the power of patience, of presence, of simply staying when everyone else runs away. If this story is giving you chills right now, show me by hitting that like button. And if you're wondering whether Kale will ever hear his children laugh like that, well, you need to keep watching because he's about to come home. Drop a comment telling me, do you think the children will forgive their father? Or is it too late for the Vampire King? Your engagement keeps these stories coming, so don't just watch, participate.
Let me see those comments flying.
Now back to Crimsonreach Manor, where everything is about to change. Illyra wiped her eyes. "I just stayed." Neither of them noticed the shadow that had been standing motionless at the end of the corridor for the past 5 minutes, listening to every word. Kale Dravenmore had returned to Crimsonreach Manor 3 hours earlier, emerging from the darkness, like something conjured from a nightmare. He'd sent no warning, made no announcement. He'd fought through 3 years of campaigns, crushed 2 rebellions, and reshaped the blood courts through sheer brutality. He'd told himself he was ready to come home. He'd been lying. The manor felt different the moment he crossed the threshold. Not abandoned or decayed. He'd expected that. It felt inhabited, living, as if something had taken root in his absence and transformed the tomb he'd left behind into something he no longer recognized. The servants had scattered when they'd sensed his presence, that primal instinct that told lesser beings when a predator had entered their territory. All except Illyra, who'd met him in the entrance hall with her usual composure, though he'd caught the flash of something in her eyes. Not fear. Accusation. "My lord," she'd said, bowing slightly. "Welcome home." "How are they?" he'd asked, because even after 3 years, those were the first words that came to his mouth, and he'd hated himself for it. "Changed," Illyra had replied. "Not better. Not healed."
Changed.
Meaning, you should see for yourself. She'd turned without waiting for dismissal, heading toward the stairs. "Though, I suggest you observe before you intervene." Observe. As if he were some stranger in his own home. But Kale had followed her anyway, through corridors that felt both familiar and foreign, up to the 3rd floor he'd abandoned 3 years ago. Now he stood in the shadows of a side corridor, a vampire king rendered invisible by his own reluctance, watching a scene that made no sense. The nursery door was open. Inside, his 3 children sat on the floor with a woman he didn't recognize. She wore a simple servant's dress, her auburn hair pulled back with a ribbon, her posture gentle and unassuming. Nothing remarkable about her. Nothing that explained what he was witnessing. "Can you show me which one is the tower?" The woman, Illyra, he'd heard Illyra say, asked, pointing to a set of wooden blocks scattered before them. Aloan reached forward and picked up the tallest block, holding it up. Kale's immortal heart stopped. Movement. Intentional, responsive movement. Not the mechanical motions of children going through routines, but engagement. Understanding. "Very good," Illyra said, smiling. "And can your brothers find the bridge pieces?" Riven and Thane looked at each other, then began sorting through blocks. Working together. Communicating without words, but communicating nonetheless. Kale's hands tightened on the stone archway until cracks spiderwebbed beneath his fingers. This wasn't possible. He'd brought the most powerful healers in the realm. Ancient blood mages who'd studied trauma for centuries. None of them had managed to evoke even a flicker of response. And this mortal woman with no magic, no power, no authority had them playing? "I think the bridge should go here," Illyra said, helping Thane position a piece. "What do you think? Should we build it higher?" Thane looked up at her, and even from this distance, Kale could see something in his son's face he'd thought was gone forever. Not happiness, not yet, but presence. As if Thane had returned to his own body after years of haunting it. Rage flickered through Kale's chest, hot and irrational. She'd done this. This stranger had walked into his home and accomplished what he, the immortal vampire king who commanded darkness itself, could not. Then Riven laughed. A small sound, barely audible, but unmistakable. His son had laughed. The rage collapsed into something worse. Awe. Wonder. And beneath both, a jealousy so visceral it tasted like poison. "That's a very clever bridge," Illyra said warmly. "Your mother would be proud of this. She loved architecture, did you know? Illyra told me she helped design the eastern wing." She spoke about Valorian naturally, as if his queen's name wasn't a blade that had been twisting in his chest for 3 years. And his children listened. Didn't retreat. Didn't shut down. They'd never listened like that when he'd tried to speak about their mother. They'd only gone more silent, more absent, as if his grief was too heavy for them to bear on top of their own. But with her, they stayed present. How? Footsteps in the corridor made Kale retreat further into shadow. 2 servants passed, whispering urgently. "Is it true? He's back." Rosa saw him, said he looked like death itself. "What will he do when he sees?" "Don't know. But I'm not going near that nursery. If the king finds out about the maid and the children." They hurried away, their fear perfuming the air. Kale's reputation preceded him even in his own home. They expected violence, expected rage, expected him to punish someone for succeeding where he'd failed. Maybe they were right to expect it. Part of him wanted to storm into that nursery and demand explanations. Demand to know what magic this woman had used, what bargain she'd struck, what secret she possessed that had been denied to him. But he couldn't move, because deep in the marrow of his ancient bones, he knew the truth. There was no magic, no secret, just time and patience and presence, 3 things he'd refused to give. He'd run. She'd stayed. That was the only spell that mattered. Inside the nursery, Illyra stood, brushing off her apron. "All right, let's clean up these blocks. It's almost time for supper." The children began gathering the pieces, working together. "Present. Illyra?" Thane's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like thunder. Kale's entire body went rigid. A word. His son had spoken a word. "Yes, sweetheart." Illyra knelt beside him, her voice patient. Thane pointed to a block that had rolled under a chair. "There." "Good eye," Illyra said, retrieving it. "Thank you for telling me." "Telling."
Speaking.
Thane had used words to communicate, not silence, not retreat.
Words.
Illyra, look. Eloan held up a small carved horse from the toy chest. This was Mother's.
Was.
Past tense. Acknowledging death, not pretending it didn't exist. When had his children learned to do that? It's beautiful, Illyra said, examining the carving. Should we put it somewhere special? The window, Riven said, clearly, firmly, his voice stronger than his siblings. So the sun touches it. 3 voices. 3 children who hadn't spoken in 3 years were discussing where to place their dead mother's toy. And the woman they were speaking to was a maid he'd never met. The realization hit Cale like a physical blow. His children had healed. Without him. Despite him. Because he'd left them with someone who had the courage to stay. In the nursery, Illyra was helping them arrange the wooden horse on the windowsill when Eloan suddenly wrapped her arms around the maid's waist. Don't go, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere, Illyra promised, smoothing Eloan's hair. I'll be right here. Promise? Thane asked, his small voice tight with fear that Cale recognized. The fear of another abandonment. I promise, Illyra said. I promise. All 3 children hugged her then, clinging to her like she was the only solid thing in a world made of shadows. And she held them back with a gentleness that made something crack open in Cale's chest. They'd never held him like that. Not once in 3 years. Not even before he'd left. Illyra, Riven said clearly, his face pressed against her shoulder. We love you. The words echoed through the corridor, through the manor, through the hollow space where Cale's heart used to be. We love you. 3 words his children had never said to him. 3 words they'd given to a stranger who'd done nothing but stay. Cale stood frozen in the shadows, the most feared creature in the realm, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but witness the scene he'd abandoned playing out without him. His children had found their voices. They just hadn't chosen to speak to him. His children had found their voices. They just hadn't chosen to speak to him. Cale didn't decide to move forward. His body simply did it, as if 3 years of absence had finally become unbearable. He stepped out of the shadows, his boots making no sound on the marble floor, but his presence changed the air itself, that predatory weight that announced when something ancient and dangerous had entered a room. Inside the nursery, time stopped. Illyra's head turned first. Her eyes widened, but she didn't gasp, didn't move. Just watched him with an expression that wasn't quite fear, more like witnessing something inevitable and tragic. Then the children saw him. Riven's arms, wrapped around Illyra, went rigid. Eloan's face, pressed against the maid's shoulder, slowly lifted. Thane made a small sound. Not a word, just a sharp intake of breath. And then, as if a switch had been thrown, their voices stopped. Not gradually, not hesitantly, completely. The same absolute silence that had ruled this nursery for 3 years slammed back into place like a door closing. Cale stood in the doorway, still cloaked in travel dust and the scent of distant battlefields, and watched his children retreat into themselves. Not in fear. Their eyes weren't afraid. They were choosing this. Choosing silence. Choosing to withhold from him what they'd just given to her. Riven. Eloan. Thane. His voice came out rougher than intended, centuries of command undercut by something that felt dangerously close to pleading. I've come home. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply stared at him with those silver eyes that had once been Valoria's, and now felt like an accusation. Cale forced himself to take another step into the room. Not as a king. Not with authority or expectation. Just as a man who desperately needed his children to acknowledge his existence. I know I've been gone, he said, and the words felt like swallowing glass. I know I left you, but I'm here now. You left. Riven's voice cut through the air, clear and calm and utterly devastating in its simplicity. Cale froze. His son, his heir, his firstborn by minutes, stood there with his small shoulders squared, protective even now, and delivered a verdict with 2 words. Not screamed, not sobbed, just stated. A fact as immutable as death. Riven, you left us. Riven's voice didn't waver. Mother died, and you left. Eloan turned her face away, pressing back against Illyra's side. The message was clear. She wouldn't even look at him.
Couldn't bear to.
Thane made a small whimpering sound and hid completely behind Illyra, his small hands clutching her apron like a lifeline. Cale looked to the maid, some desperate part of him hoping she would intervene, would explain to them, would. But Illyra did nothing. She stood there, one hand gently resting on Eloan's shoulder, the other steady at her side, and let the moment happen. She didn't defend him, didn't soften the blow. She simply let his children speak their truth and bear witness to it. I couldn't, Cale started then stopped.
Couldn't what?
Couldn't face them? Couldn't endure the nursery that smelled like his failure? Couldn't be the father they needed because being a king was easier? I couldn't stay.
Not with.
But she did. Riven's small hand gestured to Illyra. She stayed. The comparison was a blade between his ribs. This mortal woman with no power, no immortality, no resources. She'd done what the vampire king could not. She'd stayed. And his children loved her for it. I'm sorry. The words felt foreign in his mouth. How many centuries had it been since he'd apologized to anyone? I'm so sorry. I should have been here. I should have. But the words meant nothing. He could see it in their faces. Words were air. Promises were smoke. Only presence mattered, and he'd chosen absence. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. It wasn't the traumatized silence of 3 years ago, the silence of children too broken to speak. This was deliberate, controlled, a choice they were making together, united against him. They could speak. They simply wouldn't. Not to him. Cale felt something inside him collapse, something that had been holding him upright for 3 years, maybe longer. His knees hit the marble floor without him deciding to kneel. The most feared vampire in 3 continents, sovereign of blood courts and conqueror of kingdoms, knelt on the floor of his own nursery like a supplicant. Please, he whispered, and his voice broke on the word. Please, I'm here now. I'm staying. I won't leave again. I promise. Please. Riven looked at him for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, That's what you said last time. And turned away. Eloan followed her brother, taking Thane's hand. 3 small backs. 3 children walking away from their father as if he were a stranger who'd wandered into their home uninvited. Cale remained kneeling on the floor, trembling, while the silence he'd created judged him far more cruelly than any enemy ever had. That's what you said last time. 5 words that just destroyed a king more completely than any war ever could. If your heart is breaking right now, you're not alone. Mine is too. This is the moment where everything hangs in the balance. Will Cale earn back his children's trust, or has he lost them forever? If you're invested in this family's journey, prove it. Smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me, Team Cale or Team Children? Do you think he deserves a second chance? Or should some abandonments never be forgiven? I'm reading every single comment, and I want to know what you're feeling right now. Because what happens next will either restore your faith in redemption or break your heart completely. Let's find out together. Cale remained kneeling on the floor, trembling, while the silence he'd created judged him far more cruelly than any enemy ever had. The children had retreated to their beds, sitting together on Riven's mattress, holding hands, watching him with those silver eyes that saw everything. Illyra stood between them and Cale, not protectively, but present. Always present.
How?
Cale's voice was barely above a whisper. He looked up at her from the floor, this mortal woman who'd accomplished the impossible. What did you do? It wasn't a command. Wasn't a demand. For the first time in centuries, Cale Dravenmore was asking. Illyra was quiet for a moment, then moved to sit in the chair by the window. Not fleeing, but not approaching him either. I didn't do anything, my lord. Don't. The word came out raw.
Don't call me that.
Not here. Just tell me. Please. She studied him with those gentle eyes that had witnessed too much loss to be impressed by power. I sat with them. I spoke to them as if they were people, not problems to be solved. I didn't expect them to change or heal or speak. I just stayed. That's all. Disbelief colored his voice. No rituals? No techniques? No. That's all. Her voice was steady. Every day, I come to this room. I told them stories about grief, about my own losses. I let them be silent when they needed to be. I didn't force anything, didn't demand anything. I just made sure they knew that someone would be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Kale's hands clenched against the marble. The healers tried. I brought the best. The healers tried to fix them. Illyra interrupted gently. I didn't try to fix anything. They weren't broken, my lord. They were terrified. Of what? Of silence? Of grief? Of being left again? Her words fell like stones into still water. They didn't stop speaking because they couldn't. They stopped because if they stayed silent, maybe they couldn't be abandoned. If they didn't need anything, maybe whoever was left wouldn't leave too. The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. But I gave them everything. Resources, healers, safety. You gave them everything except yourself. There was no cruelty in her voice. Just truth. And then, when they needed you most, you left. I couldn't. Kale's voice cracked. Every time I looked at them, I saw her. I saw my failure. I couldn't. So you ran. Still gentle. Still devastating. You chose war over parenthood because war was something you understood. Something you could win. Kale's head dropped. Every word was true. Every word was a blade. But children don't need victory, my lord. They need presence. They need someone who stays even when staying is hard. Especially when it's hard. Silence filled the nursery, different from before. This silence was truth settling into bone. I don't deserve them, Kale whispered finally. No, Illyra agreed. Not right now. But you could, if you choose to. She stood, smoothing her apron with hands that didn't tremble. My work here is done. Now that you've returned, they won't need.
No.
The word tore from Kale's throat. But it wasn't his voice that stopped her. It was the sharp intake of breath from the bed. All three children were standing now, Thane's eyes wide with panic, Aloin's hands clutched to her chest, Riven's face pale. Illyra turned to look at them, and something in her expression softened. Oh, sweethearts. Don't go. Aloin's voice was barely audible. Please don't go. You promised, Thane whispered. You promised you'd stay. Riven said nothing, but his eyes held a betrayal so raw it was unbearable to witness. Illyra's composure cracked. I thought, now that your father is home. We don't want him, Riven said flatly. We want you. The words hung in the air like an execution sentence. Kale watched his children choose someone else over him in real time, and some part of him understood this was exactly what he deserved. He taught them that fathers leave. Why would they trust him to stay now? Illyra. His voice broke on her name. He was still kneeling, still broken on the nursery floor, but now he looked up at her with something beyond desperation. Please, don't leave. They need you. He swallowed. I need you to stay. Not as a servant. Not as staff. As whatever they need you to be. Whatever you're willing to be. Just please. Please don't leave them. Don't leave them like I did. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a request. It was a plea from a king who'd finally learned he had no power here. Illyra looked at the children, then at Kale, then back at the three small souls who were watching her with barely contained terror. All right, she said quietly. I'll stay. The relief that flooded through Kale was so powerful it felt like resurrection. But he knew staying wouldn't be enough. Not for him. His children had their voices back, but they'd chosen to use them for her. The real question was whether they'd ever choose to speak to him again. The real question was whether they'd ever choose to speak to him again. Kale stood in his war room 3 hours before dawn, staring at the territorial maps he'd been studying for 3 years. Markers indicated his forces, thousands of warriors spread across 3 continents, campaigns in progress, territories mid-conquest. Everything he'd built, everything he'd chosen over his children. He reached for the communication crystal. "My lord," his general's voice crackled through, confused by the unexpected summons. "Is something wrong?" "Recall the Northern Legions," Kale said. "Effective immediately." Silence. Then, "My lord, we're 3 weeks from taking the Shadow Peak territories. If we withdraw now." "Recall them." His voice was steel. "All of them. Northern, Eastern, Southern battalions. Everyone comes home. But the blood courts, the treaties we've negotiated, will survive without me." Kale's hand tightened on the crystal. "I have something more important to attend to." He could hear the shock radiating through the connection. In 3 centuries of rule, Kale had never abandoned a campaign, never chosen anything over expansion and dominance. His reputation had been built on his relentlessness. "My lord," his general tried again, "if we withdraw, the other courts will see it as weakness. They'll let them." Kale looked toward the ceiling, toward the 3rd floor where his children slept. "Let them think whatever they want. Send word to all battalion commanders. Return to Crimson Reach within the fortnight." That's an order. He severed the connection before there could be further protest. The next 3 days were chaotic. Messages flooded in from across his territories. Advisors appeared at Crimson Reach, demanding an audience, seeking explanation. Blood Court leaders sent urgent missives, some angry, some confused, some sensing opportunity in what they perceived as the Vampire King's sudden weakness. Lord Valdrin arrived personally, his entourage filling the main hall. "You promised me military support," he said, his voice echoing off marble. "We had an agreement. The agreement is void." Kale stood before his throne, but did not sit. "I'm withdrawing from all external conflicts." "Withdrawing?" Valdrin's laugh was sharp. "You don't withdraw, Dravenmore. You conquer. You've spent 3 years carving out the largest blood empire in history, and now you just, what? Walk away." "Yes." The simplicity of it seemed to shock Valdrin more than any elaborate explanation could have. "Why?" Kale's eyes moved to the staircase, where he knew 3 small souls were likely awake, probably listening. "Because I've been conquering the wrong territories." He dismissed Valdrin without ceremony. Let the blood court scramble. Let them redistribute his abandoned campaigns among themselves. Let them call him weak or mad or broken. None of it mattered anymore. On the 4th day, Kale called a formal assembly. Every servant in Crimson Reach, every guard, every advisor who'd remained. They gathered in the great hall, whispering, speculating, fearing what this summons meant. Kale stood before them without his ceremonial armor, without the trappings of office. Just a king addressing his household. "For 3 years I abandoned this manor," he said, his voice carrying through the vast space. "I chose war over family, power over presence. I was wrong." The words felt like removing arrows from old wounds. "Effective immediately, I'm stepping back from all military campaigns. My armies will return home. My focus will be here, at Crimson Reach, with my children." Shocked silence. Then Alara, standing near the front, began to nod slowly. Others followed, understanding dawn. "Lady Illyra Fenwick," Kale continued, and Illyra, who'd been standing with the other staff, looked up in surprise, "is no longer to be considered household staff. She is under my direct protection as guardian and caretaker to my heirs. Her authority in matters concerning my children is absolute." Illyra's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to protest, but Kale shook his head slightly. "Not a command.
"A request." "That is all," he said.
"Return to your duties." As the crowd dispersed, Kale walked to the center of the hall where a pedestal held his ceremonial crown, a relic of silver and obsidian, worn by Dravenmore kings for 5 centuries. He lifted it, feeling its familiar weight, then carried it not to his head but to a locked cabinet in his study. He placed it inside and turned the key. The children watched from the top of the staircase. Cale could feel their eyes on him. When he looked up, they didn't run. But they didn't come closer either. They simply witnessed 3 small judges determining whether his actions matched his words. That evening, Cale returned to the nursery. Not barging in, not commanding. He knocked softly on the doorframe. Illyra looked up from where she sat reading to the children. "My lord, may I?" His voice was uncertain in a way it hadn't been in centuries. "May I come in?" The children stiffened, but they didn't say no. Illyra nodded. Cale entered slowly, then did what he should have done 3 years ago. He sat down on the floor, not in a chair above them, not standing with the authority of height, on the floor at their level, making himself small. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quietly, addressing his children but not expecting a response. "I'm not asking you to speak to me or trust me or love me. I'm just going to be here. Every day. Whether you want me to be or not. I'm staying." Silence. But Riven's eyes, cold and evaluating, tracked his every movement. Illyra continued reading, her voice soft and steady, and Cale sat in the corner of the nursery, the most powerful vampire in 3 continents reduced to a father learning how to occupy space without demanding it be his. When Illyra finished the story, Thane whispered something to her. She nodded, then looked at Cale. "Thane asks if you'll be here tomorrow night too." Cale's throat tightened.
"Yes."
"Every night. For as long as you'll let me." Thane didn't respond, but he didn't hide his face either. It was the smallest of victories. But for a king who'd lost everything, it felt like hope. It was the smallest of victories. But for a king who'd lost everything, it felt like hope. The first week, Cale simply occupied space. He sat in the nursery corner each evening, sometimes for hours, saying nothing.
Just being there.
The children would glance at him occasionally, measuring, testing whether he would actually remain, or if this was another false promise wrapped in good intentions. He remained. The second week, Illyra began teaching him their routines. Riven likes his books organized by color, she explained quietly while the children played. Elowen needs the window open at night. Thane won't eat unless his siblings eat first. Cale listened. Memorized. These small details his children had developed in his absence, these personalities that had bloomed without him. He learned them like a new language. "May I help?" he asked one evening when Illyra was preparing their bedtime tea. She studied him, then nodded. 2 spoonfuls of honey, for Elowen. 1 for the boys. And Thane's cup needs to be the blue one, or he won't drink it. Cale prepared the tea with hands that had ended lives, wielded ancient magic, commanded armies. Now they measured honey and selected the correct cup, and somehow this felt more important than anything he'd done in 3 centuries. When he brought the tray to the table, Thane looked at his blue cup, then up at Cale. Something flickered in his silver eyes. Not forgiveness, but recognition that his father had remembered. The third week, Riven spoke to him for the first time.
Not warmly.
Not with affection.
But he spoke.
"You're sitting in Illyra's chair." Cale looked down, realized he'd taken the seat by the window without thinking. "I apologize." He moved immediately to the floor. Riven watched him sit on the marble, this king willingly making himself lower than his own children, and something in his small face softened. Just slightly. By the 4th week, small moments began to accumulate. Elowen showed him a drawing she'd made, not offering it to him, but letting him see it. Thane fell asleep during story time with his head against Cale's leg, though he startled awake and moved away when he realized. Riven asked him a question about the stars visible from the nursery window, and Cale answered carefully, not elaborating beyond what was asked. 1 month became 2. 2 became 3. One evening, as Illyra was tucking them in, Elowen asked quietly, "Can we talk about Mother?" The room went still. Cale, sitting in his usual corner, tensed. "Of course," Illyra said gently. "What do you want to know?" "Father never talks about her." Eloan's eyes moved to Kale. Did he love her? The question was a blade. Kale's throat closed. But Illyra waited, letting him answer or not answer. His choice. Yes, Kale finally said, his voice rough. More than my own existence. Your mother was, he started again. She was the only thing that ever made immortality feel like a gift instead of a curse. Riven was watching him now, really watching. She wanted you to know her, Kale continued. She made me promise, before she died, that you would know who she was. Not just that she died for you, but how she lived, how she laughed, how she believed that mercy was strength, not weakness. How she, his voice broke, how she would have been so proud of how brave you've been. Thane sat up in his bed. Do we look like her? You have her eyes, Kale said. All three of you. Every time I look at you, I see her. That's why he stopped himself. No excuses. That's why I ran. Because seeing her in you hurt too much. But that was cowardly. She died protecting you. The least I could do was stay and raise you. I failed her. I failed you. I'm sorry. Silence. Then Eloan whispered. It still hurts. Missing her. I know, Kale said. It will always hurt. But maybe it can hurt less if we remember her together. Something shifted in the room. Not healing, not yet. But the beginning of it. 3 months after Kale returned, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, he sat on the nursery floor reading a book about dragons. Riven and Eloan were building a tower of blocks. Thane was drawing. Illyra was mending a torn sleeve. Normal. Quiet. Unremarkable. Then Thane laughed at something in his drawing, and Eloan laughed in response, and suddenly the nursery was filled with the sound of children being children. Kale looked up from his book, and his eyes met Illyra's across the room. She smiled slightly, that gentle expression that had saved his family when he couldn't. Father? Riven's voice cut through the laughter. Kale's heart stopped. Father. Not my lord. Not silence. Father. Yes. Will you help us build this tower? It keeps falling. It was just a request about blocks. Just a child asking for help with a game. But to Kale, it was everything. Yes, he said, setting down his book. I'd like that very much. He moved to sit beside them, and this time, they didn't move away. Later that night, long after the children had fallen asleep, Kale stood at the nursery window. Dawn was approaching, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Normally, he would retreat to his chambers before the sun fully rose, seeking the comfort of darkness. But Illyra was sleeping in the chair, exhausted from a long day, and his children were breathing peacefully in their beds, and the light was beginning to stream through the windows, and Kale realized something profound. He wasn't afraid of the dawn anymore. He'd spent 3 years running from light, from life, from the pain of staying present. But his children had found their voices in the sun. They'd learned to laugh again in daylight. And if he wanted to be part of their world, he needed to stop hiding in darkness. So Kale Dravenmore, the vampire king who'd conquered continents and commanded the night itself, stood in the nursery as the sun rose over Crimsonreach Manor and made a choice that no amount of power could make for him. He stayed. Not because it was easy. Not because the grief was gone or the past was erased or everything was healed. But because his children were learning to live again, and this time, he would be there to witness it. This time, he would remain. And there it is. The vampire king who conquered continents finally learned the only battle that truly mattered, the battle to stay. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe that even the most broken families can find their way back to each other, then do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications, because tomorrow I'm bringing you another story that will shake you to your core. Give this video a like if you believe in second chances, if you believe that love isn't just about grand gestures, but about showing up every single day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And here's what I want to know. Drop a comment telling me your favorite moment from this story. Was it Illyra's first night in the nursery? Eloan's fragile laugh? Riven's devastating truth? Or Kale kneeling before his children? I read every comment, and your words inspire the stories I bring you next. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to come home, that healing doesn't happen overnight, and that sometimes the greatest strength is simply choosing to remain. Thank you for being part of the story family. Thank you for staying with me through every heartbreak and every triumph. I'll see you tomorrow with another tale that will remind you why stories matter. Until then, remember, the most powerful magic isn't in spells or strength. It's in staying. Now go share this with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one.